This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about a quiet change in how power moves, a change so procedural it barely registers. Until it does, somewhere inside the machinery of government, a rule you were never asked to vote on began to harden. That federal resources are no longer neutral. That access is conditional. That belonging can be measured, sorted, and priced. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed. Money was simply paused, permissions delayed, support withdrawn, not because the law changed, but because loyalty was tested. If that sounds abstract, stay with me. Because once a system learns it can reward compliance and punish dissent without saying so out loud, it doesn't need speeches anymore. It only needs spreadsheets. This is the moment before normalization. The moment when a republic still looks like itself, but no longer behaves like one. Watch closely, because what happens next explains everything that follows. You're trained to look for villains, faces, names, temperaments. That instinct is understandable, and it is exactly what this system now counts on. Because the real control point has shifted quietly, procedurally. Power no longer sits primarily in speeches or executive orders. It sits in timing, in approvals, in whether money moves or stalls, in whether a grant clears, whether a permit survives, whether a program is interpreted generously or narrowly. What governs outcomes now is not ideology. It's discretion. And discretion, when detached from neutrality, becomes leverage. This is how the system is being reframed. Not as a shared federal structure, but as a conditional network where resources flow toward alignment. And friction appears where resistance lives. No announcement is required. No law needs to pass. The mechanism works because it feels administrative, boring, technical, and that is precisely why it's so effective. Because once governance is reduced to selective enforcement, the question stops being what the law says and becomes who the system recognizes. And that's where this starts to accelerate. There was a time when this kind of power moved loudly. It arrived with legislation, with votes, with arguments you could see coming. That's no longer how it works. The shift didn't happen overnight. That's the point. It happened through normalization before federal money followed formulas. Eligibility, statute, you qualified or you didn't. Now, the same programs exist, same names, same line items, but something subtle has changed. The question is no longer, are you eligible? It's, are you aligned? Funds don't disappear. They hesitate. They slow. They get reevaluated. They remain technically intact while becoming practically unreachable. Before, politics shaped priorities. Now it shapes access. And slow change is always the most dangerous kind. Because nothing feels stolen. Nothing feels broken. People adjust. States adjust budgets. Institutions adjust speech. Organizations learn what not to say. This is how a system teaches behavior without issuing commands. This is how silence becomes policy. And once a system learns it can do this quietly, it doesn't stop. It scales, because now the damage doesn't look like damage at all. It looks like administration, then this stopped being theoretical, because the pause became visible. Billions of dollars already approved, already allocated, suddenly not moving. Clean energy projects midstream, timelines disrupted, contracts frozen, states told quietly that funding would continue in some places and not in others. Not based on need, not based on readiness, based on how those places had voted. That detail matters because this wasn't favoritism. It was punishment. This wasn't pork barrel politics. This was negative governance. Resources withheld not to reward allies, but to discipline opponents. And the system didn't hide it well. It admitted it. That's when the court stepped in. Fast, blunt, blocking the cuts as illegal, Not because clean energy is special, but because the power being claimed was, if the executive can decide that federal money only flows to compliant states, then the union isn't shared anymore. It's conditional. This ruling stopped the damage, but it didn't undo the lesson. Because now everyone saw the test run, and everyone learned what was almost possible, and that changes behavior long before the next order is ever written. Here's the part most people miss. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't impulse. It was design. Because once you look across the pattern, the mechanism becomes clear. Congress appropriates money. Statutes define eligibility. But the executive controls the path in between. Interpretation, timing, certification, release. That middle space is where power now concentrates. If funds can't be openly canceled, they can be slowed. If grants can't be revoked outright, they can be reconsidered. If permits can't be denied on the record, they can be buried in process. Who benefits is obvious. The executive gains leverage without leaving fingerprints. Who absorbs the damage is quieter. States planning budgets. Institutions relying on continuity. Families whose services depend on money arriving on time. No one announces the trade-off, but everyone feels it. And once that mechanism is understood, behavior changes upstream. Criticism softens. Positions narrow. Risk disappears. Not because anyone was ordered to comply, but because the cost of dissent was demonstrated. This is how governance becomes self-enforcing. Not through force, through anticipation. And once anticipation replaces law as the guiding principle, the system doesn't need to break rules anymore. It just needs to remind you who controls the valve. And that's when the next shock comes faster. Then the tempo changed. The pauses weren't isolated anymore. They stacked, grants canceled, then reinstated, then threatened again. Medical organizations criticized policy. Funding vanished. Not debated, not reviewed, gone. States resisted pressure. Election support was put on the table, then pulled back. Infrastructure projects approved, then suddenly under review, then stopped. Each move alone could be explained away. Together, they form acceleration. Shorter timelines, less warning, higher stakes, and the message sharpened. You don't have to be defiant to feel it. You just have to be visible. Because when retaliation becomes administrative, it doesn't need justification. It only needs precedent. And precedent had now been established. The courts intervened, again, calling it illegal, calling it retaliation. But here's the problem. Judicial rulings arrive after damage begins, after uncertainty spreads, after people learn the risk. So even when the system blocks the action, the signal still lands. This is what escalation looks like without sirens. Faster cycles, less deniability, higher tolerance for conflict. And once a system crosses that threshold, the next phase isn't louder. It's closer. This is where it reaches you. Not abstractly, not politically, practically, because when funding becomes conditional, the buffer disappears. Childcare programs don't wait for court rulings. Health services don't pause without consequences. Election offices don't operate on uncertainty. You feel it as delays, as shortages, as explanations that don't quite explain anything. A form that used to clear doesn't. A service you relied on is suddenly under review. A cost shifts from the federal line to your local bill. No one tells you it's punishment. No one has to. Because the system doesn't need you to understand the cause. It only needs you to absorb the effect. And that's the point. When pressure is applied upstream, the impact is always downstream. You are not the target. You are the leverage. And the quiet genius of this model is that it fractures accountability. You can't point to one decision, one order, one villain, just a pattern. And patterns are harder to protest. This is why courts matter here. Why these rulings aren't technical, they are interruptions. Because without them, the lesson would be permanent. That your access to stability depends on alignment you never agreed to. And that realization doesn't end here. It moves outward. Once this logic exists domestically, it doesn't stay contained because systems copy what works. When funding becomes conditional inside a federal union, markets notice, allies notice, competitors notice. Investment begins to price in political volatility. Long-term projects hesitate. Infrastructure timelines stretch. Energy markets don't care about party labels. They care about predictability. And predictability just became negotiable. International partners watching this see something else: a federal government willing to fragment internally to treat regions differently based on political alignment. That changes how commitments are read, how guarantees are trusted, how durable agreements feel. This isn't about reputation. It's about reliability. Because if a government can quietly condition support at home, there's no reason to assume its external commitments are insulated from the same logic. And now the spillover accelerates. States hedge. Institutions diversify risk. Legislatures push back. The system grows friction, not collapse, not yet, but resistance. And resistance creates pressure between branches, between levels of government, between expectation and reality. This is the moment where containment either holds or starts to slip, because the more openly this model is tested, the more openly it will be challenged. And what happens next depends on which force moves faster. From here, the system doesn't have one future. It has three, and none of them are clean. The first is adjustment. Institutions adapt, courts intervene faster. Congress reasserts control over money, over war, over administration. The executive learns the limits. Pressure is absorbed. The system bends but holds. The second is erosion. Nothing snaps, but each test leaves residue. Delays become normal. Retaliation becomes harder to prove. Institutions grow cautious. Dissent narrows. The law still exists, but behavior quietly changes around it. And then there's rupture. That's when a future executive learns from these failures. Learns where the courts are slow, where statutes are vague, where pressure works before injunctions arrive. That executive won't admit intent, won't leave a record, won't test one lever at a time. They'll coordinate funding, permits, appointments, timing, not to overthrow the system, but to hollow it. And that's the danger of this moment. Not what happened, but what was learned, because every blocked attempt still teaches the same lesson: how close the system came, where it held, where it almost didn't. We are no longer asking whether this power exists. We're deciding which path it takes. And the choice is still unresolved. So here's where I won't reassure you, because reassurance is how this slips past. What you've been watching isn't a breakdown. It's a stress test. A system pushed until it reveals where it resists and where it yields. The courts held. Congress pushed back for now. But nothing about this guarantees permanence. Institutions don't stay strong by memory. They stay strong by use. Every time power tests the edges and survives the pushback, it collects data. Every delay teaches timing. Every injunction teaches restraint or refinement. This isn't about one administration or one party or one moment. It's about whether conditional governance becomes a tool waiting on the shelf. Because once a system learns, it can sort citizens, states, or institutions by compliance. Even briefly, that knowledge doesn't disappear. It waits. If you want to understand what happens next, you can't look for spectacle. You have to watch the boring parts: budgets, delays, reviews. That's where this either ends or quietly restarts. If you want to stay ahead of it, stay curious, stay precise, and don't look away when nothing seems to be happening, because that's usually when it is.